So just something I wanted to go over really quickly. When we talk about using some of the different softwares, there can be a lot of technical terms. And some of the terms are easy to figure out as we're doing things, as we're using them. You start to build an idea of what they are as we actually create with them. But some of them are less obvious. When we talked about Illustrator, we mentioned, or we went over a little bit, vector versus bitmap. And that's very important, and hopefully you remember that. If you're not familiar with it, go back and take a look at it. However, when it comes to Photoshop, there's a different thing that's also important. So being that Photoshop works with pixels and not with code-based vector or math-based vectors, every time you make changes, it's actually changing the pixels themselves. At least it used to be. However, Photoshop introduced some features a little while back, quite a while back now actually, that allowed you to edit things non-destructively. So let's take a look. I'm just going to open my bunny here that I created for something else. Alright, so here we have my bunny. This bunny was actually created in Illustrator, but it's been exported as, I think, a PNG. Yeah, a PNG. And so what was created by math-based vector is now been converted into little bitty dots close together to create the illusion of a solid image. But if we zoom in enough, you can see those dots once again. So as we edit an image, if we're working in Photoshop or something else that's bitmap based, these are actually changing the pixels themselves. I cannot move that swirly bit, that squiggly bit that I just made. Instead, I move the whole image because it is all attached together. So let's go back. However, with the addition of layers, I can now add stuff on top that is not modifying what's below it. And that's essentially what non-destructive editing is. It's editing things without damaging the original pixels. Now, we've had multiple layers for a while. However, there are some things that we haven't had for as long, such as these adjustment layers. Originally, you had to go up to adjustments and make your changes here. And I mean, it was useful, it was good, but there were issues with it. Because once you made that change, if you wanted to go back to your original, you couldn't unless you either went back to the very, very start or you still had it in your history and hadn't made too many steps. And if you had actually saved it, well, it was gone. Your original was gone. And so that's destructive editing. It's changing the pixels themselves. And not only that, but if you use filters, which we've used in a few of the videos, those make changes to that as well. So if we instead go back to our start, the difference is these adjustment layers. These very same changes that we can make up here, we can now make here. And instead, now they are on top in a new layer that also has its own mask that allows us to hide or show how much of that effect is appearing or where that effect is appearing. There we go. Well, that's a little bit hard to see. What if we up the saturation? There you go. Now you can see where it's erasing. It's a great color for a rabbit, isn't it? Not only that, but we can also use smart filters. We didn't use any smart filters in the earlier videos, but we could have if we wanted to. What I typically choose to do is I just duplicate the layer and do it on a new layer, which really isn't that much different from doing a smart filter, but it's what I'm kind of used to just from using older versions. So it turns the layer basically into a smart layer, and now when I use a filter on it, now you can see the filter is below, and you can see it has that mask there as well, which I can make modifications to just the same way that I make modifications to anything else that has a mask on it. And I can change the blending modes up here and change the opacity and a lot of those same things that we're used to. It's really a more efficient way of doing things. I'm just not really used to it from using older versions, so sort of force of habit to use a duplicate layer for me. And so the old way of doing adjustments was to go into image and do adjustments there. But just like with the filters, this is actually modifying the layer itself. And if we keep doing this, it can actually start to damage the pixels. So I'm going to very quickly make a bunch of adjustments on here and see if I can get it to show you that. Now granted, if you were to put all of these as adjustment layers on top of it, you might notice some similar things to it. But the difference is, if you're doing adjustment layers on top, with masks and whatnot, you can always go back to the originals if you need to. Whereas if you've done all these adjustments on the layer itself and not use separate layers, well, it's too late. It's going to be really hard to try to go back to your source. Not only that, but by being able to have different adjustment layers on top, it's going to be a smaller file size because you're not duplicating the individual data of each and every dot on each one of those layers. Instead, you just have a layer on top that is telling it how to manipulate the data that's below it. Alright, so you're starting to see that banding there, especially in the ear. You're starting to definitely damage and deteriorate the pixels as I'm making more and more of these adjustment layers. And some of that was there before, but it wasn't noticeable until doing all of these adjustments. The difference is much more distinct now that I've done all these adjustments to it, and I can't easily go back unless I start back over from the very beginning.